Hello everybody, and I'd like to welcome you to the third event of the Christian Union's Impossible, Improbable, Irrelevant Week. My name's Tom, if I haven't met you. It's really great that you're here. We've spent a week investigating the resurrection of Jesus, which we think is one of the most important questions there is. I'd also like to pay a special mention to Cheese Sock, who've provided our wonderful food this evening. So if you ever put on an event, consider using Cheese Sock. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, who is Dr. Michael Ramsden. He'll be addressing the question, what does the resurrection of Jesus mean today? Is Christianity irrelevant? On your desk, there are some feedback forms which you may like to fill in, and behind me there's a number that you can text at any point in the evening with any questions, and Michael Ramsden will address those in the second part of our evening. Michael used to teach moral philosophy at Sheffield University. He is currently director of the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics and has been invited to lecture to groups all over the world, including members of the European Parliament, the leaders of NATO, and the staff of the White House in Washington, D.C. And since Sunday has been in Hong Kong, Chicago, Dallas, and Memphis, and has just arrived in the UK today to be with us. So we're very privileged to have him with us. So let me welcome Dr. Michael Ramsden.
Hi, well, good evening. Here's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to try and keep my remarks relatively brief and then throw this open for Q&A so that you can ask whatever questions that you would like to. Let me just start off by telling you just a little bit about me, so you just have some personal background. Although I was born in this country, I spent most of my childhood in the Middle East, where I was raised in Saudi Arabia. I grew up in a situation where I wasn't particularly interested in either God or religion. I wasn't an atheist. I wasn't anti. I wasn't against him. I just wasn't for him either. As far as I'm concerned, there was actually nothing I was particularly interested in about him. And then during my childhood and during my teenage years, my parents moved to a country called Cyprus, and while I was there, I had the opportunity to go to church, which I went to, which thoroughly bored me, I have to say. And as far as I could tell, most of the people who were in it were hypocrites. So I wasn't very interested in them either. So neither the institution, nor the service they provided, nor the people in it seemed particularly interesting. However, while I was also there, I met a few people who described themselves as Christians, and there was something very different about their life. There was something different about the way they lived. There was something different about the way they spoke. There was something different about who they were. That grabbed me. I got to know them. I set up a little discussion group and got these people to run it because I thought I would like to talk about some of these questions. And we brought all of our friends along. And we started on the first evening, one evening, midweek, with about 6 of us. And we had a very interesting discussion, which ranged about existence of God, meaning and purpose of life, what the Bible has to say about various of these things, and the opportunity to ask lots of questions. We liked it so much, we came back the following week and brought more of our friends till we eventually grew to about 60 people. When we had about 60 people, the people who were running this particular little group said, well, we'd like to go away for a weekend somewhere, but we can't organize it. I said, no problem, I can help organize this for you. They needed permissions from the government and various other things to run at this camp, and we were able to get all of those quite easily. And then I went up a day early to help set up this camp. And on the second day of this weekend retreat, I became a Christian. So I actually had a role in organizing and planning my own conversion to the Christian faith, which isn't really that common. I guess it's a very distinct privilege. But that would just tell you a little bit about me now. One of the things that happened during that whole time of conversation was about 3-4 months in, we did a whole series on the resurrection. Did it actually happen? And I can remember we talked about this and we debated about this for a little while, and a couple of weeks into it, we were all asked to present cases against the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so as an atheist, at that point, well, I wasn't an atheist really, I was more an agnostic. And I can remember as an agnostic, having read through various different books and looked at various different forms of argument, I presented 6 arguments against the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and then dismantled each one and said it couldn't possibly be correct for the following reasons. And then ended up concluding at the end of my talk that it definitely happened. Now, I can remember at this point, the guy who was running this group, he was a Christian, and obviously he wanted me to become a Christian. And I think he came up to me at the end and said, so are you a Christian now? I said, no. And so he said, but you believe Jesus Christ rose from the dead? I said, looks like it definitely happened. And I can remember the look of complete frustration on his face, hearing me that I had come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ had rose from the dead, but actually didn't make any difference to me whatsoever. It is what happened. And what I'm going to try and do this evening, because this is a series of 3, there's already been a talk on, is it possible for miracles to occur? In other words, is it possible in a scientific age to believe in things like the resurrection? Or does the nature of science itself make that impossible? So I'm not going to be addressing that issue at all, apart from maybe just to give just one simple illustration, which, having not heard the talk on Monday, it's probably dangerous for me to try to summarize it, but I'm guessing that one of the points would have been something along these lines. If you want to try to argue that because we live in a world of science, you can't believe in things like the miracles, you run into an immediate problem. The immediate problem is this, and it was actually given, this argument, a long time ago by a guy called C.S. Lewis in a small little book he wrote. And it's just interesting that not many people seem to have picked up at it in the way they should. But here's what he said. He said, he says, you get home from work one day, and you go up into your bedroom, and, you take your coat off, and you're getting undressed, you take your wallet out of your pocket, and as you're in the habits of doing, you just take all the cash which is out of your wallet, and you put the wallet on top of your bed, and you put all the cash that's in your wallet into your bedside table. And it's assuming that there's £2,000 in there. Okay, so that's what goes into your bedside table. Petty cash, just enough, well, at today's prices, to buy a couple of Starbucks. Then, he says, the next night you come and you repeat the whole thing all over again. He says you come back into your bedroom, you get undressed, you take your wallet out, you take out all the loose change from your wallet, another $2,000, you put it in your bedside table. He said the third morning you wake up and you open the drawer in your bedside table. And inside, what should you expect to see? And the answer is, now, I know that we're a technical university here and the maths may be quite pretty hard, but the answer is £4,000. He said you open the drawer and inside you see there's only £1,000. Now, what do you conclude? That the laws of mathematics have been broken. Now, what you'll conclude is that the laws of the land have been broken. Someone has come into your bedroom, opened your drawer, and taken £3,000 out of it. I was speaking in Hong Kong just a little while ago, and I was giving this illustration, and I said, what can we conclude safely from what has happened here? And a man from the back of the room was a businessman and yelled out, my wife has gone shopping. But what we can conclude with a high degree of certainty is that someone has come in from outside and removed £3,000. Now, how do we know that? Well, it's because we live in a universe where there are fixed, uniform, regular laws, where the laws of mathematics cannot be broken, that you can detect the presence of an outside intruder. It would be impossible to detect God's intervention and presence in this world if we did not live in a regular, uniformly governed, scientifically ruled universe. It would be impossible to detect the presence of an intruder unless that were the case. The reason why we can be 100% sure that a thief broke in and stole some money, that someone from outside has come in and removed something, is because we know that 2 + 2 is 4, and it always equals 4, and it always will equal 4. So the fact there's only one allows us to make some very safe conclusions. Now, we may not know who did it or whatever, but we know that something has happened and someone's taken 3,000 away. So the very fact that we live in a scientific age governed by scientific law in no way is a logical argument against God's existence. You would not be able to detect God's existence and intervention into this world unless we lived in such a universe. So, but I'm not going to go into that in huge detail because there was a whole talk given on that together with the last time of Q&A. Now, also unusually, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of talk about the historical evidence for the resurrection because there's been a talk about that too. And I'm hoping that what was sort of said during that time, even though, again, I wasn't here, so I didn't have the opportunity to hear it. I was probably halfway over one of the oceans at that point, is that actually the evidence is surprising. But here's what's important, and this is what I'm going to be focusing on this evening. Even though the amount of evidence for it is surprising, and even though in no way is it a logical or scientific impossibility, it is entirely possible to conclude, and it is entirely possible to actually believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and it doesn't make a single difference to your life. Because the question is, what does it mean? What's its significance? Why is it important? Does it make any difference? let's supposing that actually we were able to somehow prove scientifically here this evening that the sun does not go around the moon, but the earth goes around, the moon does not go around the earth, you can tell I'm tired, but the earth goes around the moon. Now, we all know that's simply can't possibly be true, but let's supposing actually that it were true and somehow I could share that information with you this evening. And it went out the next day into the national news and everyone's talking about it, about how we got it wrong for so long. Now, it would be sensational. It would be remarkable and people would be talking about it for ages and you would have a great story to tell. But what difference would it make to your life? Would you suddenly feel that you suddenly found meaning, purpose, value, that this somehow changed, in some sense, the nature of existence, who you are, that it was earth-shattering? The answer is no. It's just that something that everybody believed was then proved to be wrong. It's very interesting that C.S. Lewis, Professor C.S. Lewis, the well-known writer of the Narnia stories, who then wrote a lot about the Christian faith after his conversion, talks about the time that just before he was converted, he went to go and find the safest atheist who he knew and sat down in his study, a professor of history, and said to him, basically confessed to him that even though he'd been, as an atheist, had argued against the Christian faith, and even though he didn't want it to be true, that he was beginning to be troubled by God. He was beginning to be troubled by the fact that who Jesus was, what he said, and the fact that it's alleged that he rose from the dead and so on. This began to bother Lewis. And so Lewis went and sought out this professor and sat in his study. And there they are, sitting in these lovely armchairs with the fire roaring. I seem to remember that they were certainly drinking port, and I can't remember if pipes were involved or not, but obviously that's not improbable. But there they are, sat in the security of a university professor's study. C.S. Lewis is a young lecturer at this point. And then this professor puts his drink down and he says, Lewis, it's a strange thing. Looks like that resurrection thing might actually have happened. Picked up his glass and starts drinking again. Now, Lewis says he walked out of that professor's study that evening absolutely despondent. It threw him into depth of depression because he didn't want the Christian faith to be true. And here was the most secure atheist he knew who was saying, looks like Jesus Christ did raise from the dead. But notice the difference in reaction between the two. The professor, who casually throws out, I think Jesus Christ did rise from the dead, and then just starts drinking again, a professor of history, is very happy to remain in his complete disbelief in God. But Lewis was deeply troubled by it, and the reason why it threw him into depression was because at this point he was asking a different question. And the question was, what would this mean? What would be the significance of this? Why would this be important? And how would it change life and everything else? And he knew at that point it would mean it would change everything. All of us believe things in this room which, well, I'm sure hopefully all of you in this room believe some things which are true, assuming you're being educated by this university, partly at the taxpayer's expense. I hope that there's some sort of net gain in knowledge that's going on here. And some of it may even have fascinated you. You may have fallen in love with it, and you may have come here thought that you would never, ever be interested in X, Y, or Z. You wanted to do physics, but you had to do a small two-hour introduction to quantum mechanics or something like that, and then you suddenly find yourself, you've just fallen in love with that subject, or maybe you've fallen in love with something else. I hope that there are some things here that you have learned that have somehow set a fire within your heart and within your mind. But the simple truth is that those things in and of themselves aren't completely radically redefining probably who you are, why you're here. So even though you may believe something which is true, and even though you may find something which has some kind of beauty to you just in terms of an idea, that doesn't mean necessarily it's going to change your life. So the question that I've been asked to address this evening, the question that was given to me, is irrelevant. What is the relevance? What is the importance? What is the significance of the fact that Jesus Christ rose from the dead? So in light of the previous two lectures, I'm going to assume that I'm going to focus on this question. Now, I'd like to start by just reading to you. This is just a book I picked up on my travels recently, which won the Pulitzer Prize last year, which is sort of an American prize for books. Anyone from the States here? No? Oh, yeah, one. Don't worry, God will forgive you. And this book by Jennifer Egan, as far as I can tell, I'd be very surprised if she were a Christian. I'm pretty certain that she's not. But this book, A Visit from the Goon Squad, which won the Pulitzer Prize last year, I'm halfway through it, and it's very dangerous to quote from a book which you're only halfway through because I may get to the end of this book and realize that she's doing something completely different. But this book basically tells the story of the life of 5 people and how their lives intercross and interact. And at one point, one of the characters in the story finds themselves in a psychiatrist's chair. They have a problem where they're always stealing stuff. They don't need it, but they just steal it. And whenever they're visiting someone, they just steal stuff. And not necessarily valuable stuff, although sometimes it's valuable. It's just stuff that they steal and then they collect. And they're just addicted to a pattern of behavior. And the question that she keeps asking herself is, all of these choices I'm making, where are they taking me? Towards a happy ending or away from a happy ending? That's the question that keeps coming back to her. And then at one point, as she sat in this chair, she's been visiting a friend, someone who she actually likes, she gets along well with, actually enjoys their company. And they're in their home, and the guy goes to use the toilet, and so she just sees it as a little display, and she steals something from this glass table, okay, and puts it in her pocket. And having promised herself she should never steal anything again, she just sees it, the moment's there, she thinks, I want a memento, and she takes it, promising that actually maybe she'll give it back to him, but she never ever does. And so the psychiatrist, who's called Cos, says, Did you put it back? I didn't have a chance. He came out of the bathroom. What about later, after the bath, or the next time you saw him? Well, after that he left. I haven't talked to him since. There was a pause, during which she was keenly aware of the psychiatrist behind her waiting. She wanted to please him, to say something like, it was a turning point. Everything feels different now. Or, I called up Lizzie, who is a friend of hers who she hasn't spoken to in decades, and we made up. Or, I've picked up the harp again and started playing. Or, I've changed. Redemption, transformation. God, how she wanted these things. Every day, every minute. Didn't everybody? Please, she said to ask the psychiatrist, please don't ask me how I feel. All right, he said quietly. They sat in silence, the longest silence that ever passed between them. She looked at the window pane, rinsed continually with rain, smearing lights in the falling dark. She lay with her body tense, claiming the couch, her spot in this room, her view of the window and the walls, the faint hum that was always there when she listened, as the minutes of the psychiatrist's time went by. Then another, then one more. It's a fascinating book. I'm only halfway through, so I can't actually tell you what the ending is, so I can't ruin it for you. But here's what I find fascinating about this book, as I say, which has won, certainly, last year, one of the most prestigious prizes you can win in literature. The question which comes up again and again and again in the book is this. We are broken people. This tells the story of 5 lives. All of them are broken. Everyone has taken choices which at the time seemed to be good to them, but have ended up hurting them. And so at the time where happiness, when they were young, because the book starts the story, well, eventually it goes backwards and forwards in time, when they were teenagers, happiness seemed obvious and easy. As they get older and older, as they live with the consequences of choices which they took earlier, which seemed to be so blindingly obvious to them, as they live with those consequences, life becomes harder. It becomes more complicated. It becomes more difficult. It becomes more painful. And now she's asking the question, and indeed all of the characters in this book are asking the same question. Can I change? Am I changing? Is redemption and transformation possible? Everybody wants that, don't they? But it doesn't seem to come. The time is passing. She's sitting in the chair. She's with an expert, a psychiatrist who should be able to help her. And the minutes are ticking by, but nothing's changing. There is no transformation. There is no redemption. That's just where they are. And she describes it brilliantly, which is why I'm enjoying reading the book, and I'm sure why she's won a prize. Now, it's in light of that struggle, in light of that question, I'd like to raise the question about the relevancy of the resurrection. And I'm going to do it in a slightly unusual way. I'm pretty certain that if you've got anyone to come and give a talk answering this particular question, I can think of more obvious ways of speaking to this issue, but as I was just preparing for this, I'd like to do it in a slightly more unusual way, because I'd like to address this issue of relevancy in a way that I hope will be both challenging and informative. And I'd like to do it, if you like, in light of what I see a lot of people wrestling with right now. Just keeping Jennifer Egan's words ringing in your ears, let me just read a few words to you from the Apostle Paul. Now, this may seem to be talking about something completely different at this point, but Paul was an early Christian, and he's speaking to a group of people in Athens. And he's speaking in a place where the Areopagus, where it's described that everybody just sat around listening to the latest ideas. That's what they simply did. And Paul is speaking to them, and he says to them this. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of the heaven and the earth. And he doesn't live in temples built by human hands, and he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the times set for them and the exact places where they would live. God did this so that men would seek after him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Since therefore we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed, and he has given proof of this to all people by raising him from the dead. Paul here referring to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That is chapter 17, okay, of the book of Acts. Okay. Now, these may immediately seem to be two very disparate readings I've given to you, one from Jennifer Egan, one from the Apostle Paul. What on earth do they have in common? And why is this relevant to us today? And what on earth has it got to do with the resurrection? Let me see if I can solve that question for you, having set it up in this way. It's very interesting when we talk about issues to do with judgment and morality. Most of us live in a world where we make moral judgments all the time, and we are making them with increasing strength. Have a debate with anyone about the environmental issues in our world today. Take one person who believes that global warming is a myth and another person who believes it is a reality. Okay? You will find that almost everybody in the world right now has an opinion on that, certainly in the Western world. Set them debating. It will very quickly resolve, not simply into a scientific discussion, which it will, but also a moral one. What are our responsibilities? How should we live? How much should we consume? What is right? What is wrong? What is selfish? How should we live in this world? What does it mean to have responsibilities to other people? Are we responsible to other people? The moral questions which come with that issue are immense. Or let's take about the debates which are going on in the Middle East right now. I can remember being invited to a consultation in April with various sort of political leaders and leaders of various security forces from around the world when the revolt and the turmoil that we saw in the Middle East first began. And I can remember sitting in that room recording a conversation with a colleague of mine had with the head of Syrian intelligence 4 years ago. When he sat him down in a chair, he had just flown to the country to speak, and having just met up with the King of Jordan, the President Assad at that time had asked if he would be able to answer some questions about the Christian faith. And before that meeting happened, the head of Syrian intelligence was sat there, and then he looked up from his chair and he said, I give this part of the world no more than 5 years and then it will all blow up. Which at the time seemed like a very strange thing to say, but in retrospect seemed to have been amazingly insightful. But why was it going to blow up? What was going to go wrong? Why is it that it seems that some of these things are so fragile? But you raise that issue. It's a moral issue. I can remember the former British Foreign Secretary in this consultation I was sitting in April, who I have to say was a man who I went in. It was quite embarrassing. I went into this meeting without a pen or a paper. There were 15 of us sat around the table. And he was going to do the first contribution. And I sort of sat there rather smugly thinking, well, this guy's got nothing to say. And he started speaking. It was about 5 minutes in. I thought, this guy's more intelligent than I thought. There are some intelligent politicians in the world. And then immediately got convicted for my smugness. But the line he threw out that just stuck in my head was this. He said, hypocrisy is the new global unforgivable sin. He said it's the information that people have in the internet where they can see how their leaders are living and compare it to what they're saying, and to see the blatant, obvious hypocrisy that is fueling the anger, the disillusionment, the hatred. It's the new unforgivable sin. And everyone in the room took pause, and then everyone nodded, and everybody wrote it down. And it's a moral judgment. It's not a political one. It's not a military one. It's not even a social one. It is a moral judgment. It's very interesting when Christians talk about the fact that there will come a time when God will judge everyone and hold us to account, that most people feel that that should be a source for anger. Does that make sense? That the person who would make such a claim should say it angrily, God is going to come and judge you. And the way we should respond with anger, how dare he? And yet we do it all the time. We live in a morally governed universe and we cannot escape the moral realities which are around us. If you have a friend in this world, that friendship is a function of fellowship. You have fellowship with them. You have intimacy with them. You can be vulnerable with them. That fellowship, vulnerability, openness is a function of trust. It's because you can trust them. And trust is the moral side of truth. If you have friends who you share things with, personal things, intimate things, and the next day they put it up on Facebook, or, I mean, I'm so out of date, I don't do Facebook, I don't twit, and I don't even do whatever else the new thing is now. I'm just so far out of date. But so I even know that he's talking about Facebook means that I'm already, 5 years behind the curve, technologically speaking. But if you have a friend who, whenever you share something intimate and personal with, they go and tell everybody else, you feel betrayed. You feel angry. Because someone has violated the trust, the moral trust they put in you, and they have broken it. And it hurts. So the things which are most meaningful to you are morally governed as well. It's not just the fact that we live in a morally governed universe where we're making moral judgments all of the time. It's interesting how we look for morality. We expect it from our friends. We're very good to excuse it from ourselves. Oh, yes, but I had a good reason for breaking this trust. But we demand it from other people, and we demand it very strongly. All of your friendships, all of your relationships are morally governed. Violation of them leads to their breakdown. Now, I don't have time, I don't have all of the quotes here with me, but all of these things become morally governed. That's why a group of philosophers, contemporary philosophers called the Black Eyed Peas, in one of their main treatises they developed 5 years ago, have a chorus which says, it's in their song called Where is the Love? That's the work. If you're looking for it, you can Google it. Which says, the truth is kept secret, it's swept under the rug. If you've never known truth, then you've never known love. And they're completely correct. Love, intimacy, fellowship, it's a function of truth. If you've never known truth, and you cannot trust anyone, then you cannot truly know love. What's happening in Egan's novel is that people are violating these principles all of the time, and they're living with the consequences. Now, we may not like the idea that there'll be held a day when we'll all be held to account in our lives, because by that measure, we're all going to find difficulty. But on the other hand, we would hate to live in a universe where these things did not happen, where there was no holding to account, where there was no enforcement of certain standards. I was in Memphis just recently, and I went to the Civil Rights Museum there, and obviously it's all mostly about Martin Luther King. Now, I've heard Martin Luther King speak, not live, obviously, I'm not that old. And just in case you're wondering, I'm about 23. I weigh about 140 pounds. And I'm deluded in some areas of my life. But there I am. I'm in this Civil Rights Museum. And my father actually is traveling with me. He's never traveled with me before when I've been speaking. And I look across to him at one point and he has tears in his eyes. At that point, I was looking at a picture, large, giant, black and white picture of a group of black men in Memphis who are about to go out on strike. And they are all wearing their uniform and a large square sign. And on the square sign, hung around their neck, are the words, just 4 words. I am a man. That's all it says. They're protesting and campaigning for one issue: to be recognized as human beings. That's all they want. Acknowledgement that we are human beings and we have the same rights and responsibilities as other human beings. And they are being broken and dehumanized by a moral collapse around them, where people are not treating them in that way. And when we treat other people morally wrongly, that's what we begin to do. We begin to dehumanize them. We treat them as less than human. Now, when Martin Luther King went down to Memphis to be part of this, and then he'd just been in Birmingham just before he went to Memphis, he was put in prison. And when he was in prison, he wrote a letter. 6 Christians, I regret to say, 6 Christian pastors wrote an open letter in the press saying that Martin Luther King should not have come down here and stirred up trouble. And he wrote a response back to them. Now, I used to teach jurisprudence of philosophy, so that's the moral theory of law. And I was amazed at this letter because he was in prison. He had no books. He had no reference. He had no access to the internet. He had nothing. He wrote a letter and his lawyer smuggled it out of the prison and then had it published in the paper the next day. So he did this from memory. And if you just Google letter from a Birmingham jail, I have to say I've always admired him as a campaigner and I've admired him as an orator. I didn't realize quite how intelligent he was until I was sitting reading this letter thinking, my goodness, you did this from memory. And it is a huge letter. I don't have time to read it to all of you. If I read you the whole letter, it would take me at least 15 minutes. So I just don't have time to do that right now. But he's writing back to them who have complained that he's stirring up trouble. And this is what he says. He says, while here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that cross my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for any constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill, and that your criticisms are sincerely put forth, I want to try to answer your statements in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. I think I should tell you why I'm here, since you have been influenced by the view which argues against outsiders coming in. I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organizing operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliated organizations across the South, and one of them is the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Frequently, we share staff, educational and financial resources with our affiliates. Several months ago, the affiliate here in Birmingham asked us to be on call to engage in a non-violent direct action program if it was necessary. We consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promise. So along with several members of my staff, I am here because I was invited. I am here because I have organizational ties here. But more basically, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ far to the corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own town. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. Now, I'm going to have to skip forward. He says there are two, and then he's talking about the fact, he says, you've criticized me for breaking the law, and this is what he goes on to say. He says, you criticize me, but I have to say this. There are 2 types of laws, just and unjust. I'll be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One not only has a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine, who's a famous early Christian, that an unjust law is no law at all. What is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with that moral law. Or to put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in the eternal law. Of course, there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evident sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you need to know what that means, you need to buy a Bible and look at a book called Daniel and read the story. On the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians, who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of the chopping block, rather than submit to unjust laws of the Roman Empire. You speak of our activity as extreme. At first, I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see my non-violent efforts as those of an extremist. I began thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of 2 opposing forces in the Negro community. One is a force of complacency. The other is a force of bitterness and hatred, and comes perilously close to advocating violence. It is expressed in the various black nationalist groups that are springing up across the nation, the largest and best known being the Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. Nourished by frustration, this movement is made up of people who've lost faith in America, who have absolutely repudiated Christianity, and who have concluded that the white man is an incorrigible devil. I have tried to stand between these 2 forces, saying that we need to emulate neither the do-nothingism of the complacent nor the hatred and despair of the nationalist. For there is a more excellent way of love and non-violent protest, and I'm grateful to God that through the influence of the church, the way of non-violence has become an integral part of our struggle. If this philosophy had not emerged by now, the streets would be flowing with blood. But though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I could continue to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Was not the Apostle Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body, he said, the marks of the Lord Jesus Christ. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, he said, I cannot do likewise, otherwise, so help me God. So the question is not whether will we be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or the extension of justice? There was a time when the church was very powerful and early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed in. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on in the conviction that they were of a colony of heaven, called to obey God rather than man. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. By their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contest. Things are different now. So often the contemporary church is weak, an ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structures of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and often vocal sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as irrelevant, as a social club with no meaning for this century. Never before have I written so long a letter. I'm afraid it's much too long to take your precious time. I assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else can one do when one is alone in a narrow cell, other than write long letters, think long thoughts, and pray long prayers? If I've said anything in this letter that overstates the truth and indicates an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I've said anything that understates the truth and indicates my having a patience that allows me to settle for anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. I hope this letter finds you strong in the Christian faith, and I hope that the circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet with each one of you, not as an integrationist or civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and Christian brother. Now, I wish I could read you more, the entire letter in its entirety. It is one unending cry for justice. I am here because justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I'm here because I have to speak out against it. I'm here, he is saying, because the violation of these moral codes means that human beings have been treated less than what they are. Now, we tend to get motivated into justice issues for reasons because we either feel sorry for people or we feel guilty about what we have. So the very rich often feel guilty about the poor that they see and think, hey, I should do something. But it's basically to make themselves feel better about themselves. When we're very angry, it's also about giving vent to our feelings. But these are actually neither the basis for justice which God implies or that Paul is talking about when he says that God will ultimately judge the world. No, there's something much deeper going on. Injustice means we start treating people as less than human beings. It dehumanizes us. The injustice, and I can't believe that this is happening in our world right now, and it is so acceptable. But I can remember watching, I'm sure some of you saw it, the BBC programme in England, was it last year, about women being bought and sold as sex slaves in the United Kingdom, imported and brought in from elsewhere, in Heathrow and British airports. And I can remember seeing that programme thinking, this is going to dominate our political landscape. People are going to come up in arms that people are being bought and sold as objects in our country today. Do you detect a great moral uprising in our nation right now? Because I don't. Abandonment, the moral framework that God has given us to live within, doesn't just simply mean that we dehumanize others, but we also become dehumanized ourselves. I've been reading a whole series of books recently by young female feminists. They're an amazing series of books. They're all atheists. They're roughly all in their mid-30s. And they all have the same complaint. and it's this. In the 70s and 80s, when we were campaigning for feminism, they said we had one cry. We wanted to be treated as human beings. The cry, central cry of feminism was, we are not sexual objects to be bought and sold for someone else's pleasure. We are human beings. Treat us like human beings. Which is why Billy Graham, one of the most famous Christian evangelists of the 20th century, and the leader of the feminist movement, who was a radical feminist left-wing atheist, were able to stand publicly in the streets of North America and burn pornography side by side, saying, it is wrong to treat someone else as an object to be consumed. You see, the relationship between subjects and objects is different. So let me just try to make this point, and then we'll come back into the flow of this argument. Love is a quality that exists between subjects, between personal subjects, right? You need two. Okay, for love to be experienced and expressed, you need two persons, right? That's the minimum number. Now, I know there are some men, especially those who go to the gym and work out regularly, who after having a shower in the morning, get dressed, comb their hair, look in the mirror, sigh, and say, I'm in love. Okay, but that's sad. Okay, because genuine love is a quality that exists between human beings, real, personal beings. Okay, and you need two of them, and it has to be reciprocated. But the relationship between a personal being and an object is not one of connection, it's one of consumption. And how much of the sex today and what passes for sex today, and certainly the huge growth in the acceptability of pornography, is basically saying it's okay to consume this. It's fine. It doesn't matter if the women are being bought and sold at a price. The fact that we can get it for free is even better. And once the free ceases to satisfy, then we're willing to pay small amounts for it. It's no big deal, right? Doesn't matter. It's estimated there are more people being bought and sold right now for the purposes of sex slavery than there were at the time of the abolition of slavery in England over 150 years ago. Now, it's not just the fact that when we violate these moral principles that we treat other people as being less than human. We ourselves, here's a big philosophical phrase, where you become ontologically diminished. We lose capacity to feel and act as a human being. We increasingly objectify other personal objects around us. And we just think about them in terms of, if your, breast size, fullness of lips, tightness of your behind. None of which, as you can see, I'm particularly doing very well on, but this is not about me. This is just the fact that we increasingly interpret a personal world around us in depersonalized terms. That is why whenever you see a serial killer who's kidnapped the fourth or fifth little boy or girl that he's going to sexually torment for a couple of weeks and then kill, that when the parents come on the TV, they are told not to appeal for their son's return or for their daughter's return. They're told to use the name and talk about them as a person. Lucy's a lovely girl. Everybody loves her. She's so friendly. And the purpose of the appeal is to start to try to get the psychopath to start thinking of that other person as a human being, not as an object to be toyed with. Not in the hope that they'll turn it back, that's highly unlikely, but in the fact that as they begin to, if they can personalize, recapture that person as opposed to an object, then it's going to be harder for that person to kill them, harder for that person to mutilate them, harder for that person simply to use them, consume them as an object for their own pleasure. Hence giving the police more time to find them and hopefully rescue them. As you sit here in this room right now, to what extent is it the case not only that you think of other people as objects, but you treat yourself as an object? It's amazing to me that we now run courses in how to market ourselves. It's amazing to me that everybody suddenly wants to look like a porn star, dress like a porn star, and act like a porn star. It's actually a good thing. A world in which moral principles have collapsed means we diminish other people, we diminish ourselves, and we lose all personal connection with God. And I would like to suggest to you that this is at the very heart of what is wrong with human nature. Now, when the Apostle Paul writes into this, he does two things. He says, first of all, he says, don't be fooled. There will come a time when God will hold each one of us to account. That's number one. But number two, he's given historical assurance of this fact because he's raised the person he's appointed as Church of the world, Jesus Christ, from the dead, proving that he himself is God. And number 3, there's a way out of this mess. The death of Jesus Christ, the death of the Son of God, the death of God on the cross in the Christian faith is to do with justice. It's to do with the fact that there has been gross injustice in this world. We have violated others, we've violated ourselves, and we've violated God. And the justice that is demanded from that and the punishment that it deserves, all the consequences of it, God himself comes into this world and he pays the price. He pays the price for our moral wrongdoing. So God is going to reestablish justice on this earth, not by simply sweeping aside the requirements of justice, but by fulfilling them. And the crimes that we have committed against ourselves, against others, and against God, which seem so petty to us, are so huge in their nature, dehumanizing us and de-godding God, are so huge that God himself knows that the only price which is appropriate to pay for crimes on this global scale is that he himself will pay. He himself will give himself up to death on the cross. Not so that justice could be circumvented, so that justice can be fulfilled. And having fulfilled the requirements of justice and paid the price for the consequences of sin, which are death, because death kills you, it kills others, it kills your relationship with God, that he has conquered over it. He not only pays the price for it, but he also conquers over the very nature of it, and he is raised to life. And this is the theological significance. This is the meaning of it. This means that if God has conquered over this and is willing to come and live in you, if you welcome him, that power which raised him from the dead is able to raise you from the dead, and you can have new life in him. And that is why that is relevant today. There was a guy called G.K. Chesterton who I often enjoy reading, and he wrote a book entitled, it was a small book, and the first chapter was entitled, What is Wrong with the World? And what he says is, you know, whenever you do political theory, you walk into the room and people will say things like, the world is sick and it has to be made better. And they use a medical analogy. And everyone talks like this. And at politician times, and we're going to hear this a lot, I can tell you, in the next year and a half, everyone's going to come up and say, things are wrong, things are bad, and I have the cure. But Chesterton says this is completely wrong. This is completely wrong terminology, because political science has a completely different problem to medical science. He said in medical science, doctors frequently disagree about what is making someone ill. Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? But every doctor agrees on what a healthy body looks like, right? Okay, so they disagree about the sickness, but they agree about what health is. He said, in political science, everyone seems happy to say, hey, we're sick and we're not well. But no one can agree on what a healthy body actually looks like. What does it mean to be human? So, he said, you may go to hospital and the doctors may send you back by necessity with one leg less, but they will not, in a creative rapture, send you back home with one leg more. Right? Everyone agrees this is what a healthy body looks like, and it doesn't involve 3 legs. Well, not at the moment anyway. He says, but in political science it's the opposite. Everyone seems happy to say, hey, we're sick. It's about the nature of health that we can't agree. We don't know what it means to be human. Jesus Christ is offering to create a new humanity. He is God. He is God who has come to earth. He is God who's come to earth and who's gone to a cross. He is God who's come to earth and gone to a cross to pay the price for what we have morally done wrong. We're killing ourselves, we're killing other people, and effectively we're trying to kill God. And he takes the consequences of that rebellion against him and against ourselves and against everybody else, and it's nailed to him on a cross. He literally takes that rebellion on into himself, and he pays the price for it, and he conquers over to it. He's raised from the dead. Having conquered that, he then comes and finds us, and he says, I've got 2 things to offer you. First of all, forgiveness. If you have morally violated someone else and you want to be reconciled to them, you need their forgiveness. So I've got a friend who's sitting here. It's a church leader in London called Wolfgang. So let's supposing I start making fun of Wolfgang. And I say to you that Wolfgang, in my opinion, is a man who has the intellectual capacity more commonly associated with forms of pond life invisible to the naked eye. Let's supposing that I use words to that effect. And let's supposing for some strange reason he feels that's insulting. And then let's also assume, just for argument's sake, that I then begin to pile on the insults. I insult him, his mother, his family, his children, and everything he's ever done. And it's funny, and it's also soul-destroying. Now, let's supposing the lecture finishes, we have a short time of Q&A, you all leave here, and he just sits in that seat, stunned. He's the last person to leave the auditorium. The next morning, you see me in Starbucks having a cup of coffee with that £4,000 I was talking about earlier. And you just come up to me and you sit next to me and you say, you're Michael, aren't you? I say, yes. You said, you spoke at Imperial. I said, oh, you recognize me, thank you. And you say, how are things between you and Wolfgang? And I say, you know what? They've never been better. Wolfie is probably the closest friend I have in the world. As a matter of fact, there isn't a more meaningful relationship I have in the world than this one, than that one. Now, what would you think of me? Now, this is when we were at a Martin Luther King rally, people would be giving me feedback at this point. You would think that I must have the emotional intelligence of a carrot, okay, to believe that having so publicly insulted, humiliated, and made fun of someone, that I can look you in the eye the next morning and say it's the most meaningful and precious relationship I have. Right? But there is one set of circumstances in which when I say that's the closest friendship I have, I'll be speaking to you the complete truth. Let's suppose in having insulted him, and you all leave the room, he comes up to me and he makes it abundantly clear that even though he has no idea why I said all of those things to me, that he wants to talk to me, that he's willing to forgive me, that he offers forgiveness to me, he extends it to me, he is gracious to me, he is kind to me. And after half an hour of him speaking to me, I start to break, maybe I even break down in tears and I say, Wolfie, I'm so sorry that I insulted you in that way. I have no idea why I spoke to you that way. I have no idea. I was completely wrong. I don't know why I made all those things up. And I say sorry. There's a big word for this. It's called repentance. Repentance is acknowledging that you're morally wrong and that you're sorry. Men are very bad at it, especially with women. I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings. That is not an apology. That's basically saying, I'm sorry that you feel sorry right now, that you think I've done something wrong. So if I can say, I'm sorry I've hurt your feelings, that's enough for you, then that gets me off the hook. But that is not an admission of guilt, nor is it an exception of responsibility. True repentance, saying sorry, means I was wrong, and I'm not doing it again. And when repentance is won at the offer of forgiveness, when the graciousness, when the forgiveness is extended to you first, and it's because that other person has been so kind, so gracious to you, when you repent, you're accepting their forgiveness as a gift. And if they mean it, if they are willing to forgive, and you have genuinely said sorry, if you have genuinely repented, the next time you walk into a room, you can tell within 1 nanosecond whether everything's okay or not. Have you ever noticed that? It's amazing. You don't even need to speak to them. Now, if they haven't genuinely forgiven you, similarly, you can walk into the room and with 1 nanosecond, you know whether it was sincerely meant. God says, even though you have done all of this, you've violated yourself, you've violated others, and you've violated me. I've paid the price. I'm willing to forgive. This is why the Christian is called, this is why we have what's called the Christian gospel. The word gospel literally means good news. The good news is not that we've violated and messed everything up. The good news is that God himself has decided to pay the price for what we have done, and he comes and offers us forgiveness as a gift, which we can receive through repentance. And number 2, just as Jesus Christ was raised to life, having become sin for us on a cross, having become a curse for us on a cross, having died for us on a cross, that same power that raised Jesus Christ from the dead can come and live in us. In other words, you can become the person who God wants you to be. He can remake you. Just after I became a Christian, well, just before I became a Christian, I'd been about 9 months, and I come to the conclusion that the Christian faith was true, and that thought depressed me immensely. I mean, it really depressed me. It depressed me because I was enjoying life so much. I was not unhappy. I was not miserable. I came from a wealthy family. I went to a good school. I was captain of the swimming team. I was captain of the tennis team. I was captain of the basketball team. I was captain of the chess team. I was in charge of the president of the debating society. I was academically, I was excelling without really trying. I was good on the sports field. I'm, good looking, modest. Modesty was a really big quality of mine when I was a teenager. And I was loving life. I loved it. And when I came to the conclusion the Christian faith was true and real, and Jesus Christ had risen from the dead, it depressed me greatly, like it depressed Lewis, for the simple reason that I thought life would be less enjoyable as a Christian than as a non-Christian. But when after 9 months of wrestling with it, I said, I can't say no to this anymore. I'm going to have to say yes. And before I became a Christian, I went and found a group of friends, and I said to them, okay, I'm going to go and become a Christian. Right after I finish talking to you, I'm going to ask them to pray for me. He said, and I just want you to know that from now on, I won't be enjoying life anymore. And that's exactly what I said, word to word. I have 5 witnesses. And I went off, and I found one of these Christians. I said, will you pray with me? At this camp that I had organized. And I was smelled a little bit of nicotine then. I'd smoked my way through 40 cigarettes before getting to that point. And they prayed with me. And the result was not depression. The result was joy. And I'd completely forgotten that the thing that had attracted me to them in the first place was the completeness and joy I saw in their lives and hearts that was missing in other people I'd met. But I was also aware of the fact that a lot of things morally in my life would have to change. 2 days later, it's a Monday morning, I'm sitting next to a girl. I'll leave unnamed. She was a model. So, attractive. 6'1". And I had been, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this. I had been charming towards her in order with the hope of getting something back. Unsuccessfully for 1.5 years. I see her Monday morning. I'm wearing the same clothes I always wear. I haven't had my hair cut. And she looks at me and she says, you've changed. There's something different about you. What is it? And I said, I'm not sure I can explain it to you. She said, try. I said, well, I became a Christian on Saturday night. She said, what on earth does that mean? I said, I'm not sure exactly I can explain to you. All I know is I'm a different person now than I was when I last saw you. She looked at me and she said, would you like to sleep with me? I remember looking at her and saying, if you'd asked me 3 days ago, the answer would have been yes. I said, but actually the answer to today is no. And I was surprised at the fact that I didn't feel any disappointment about it. Because God had not simply forgiven what I had done. God was beginning to change what I wanted to do. Do you know that new life? Do you know that forgiveness? That's what it means to be a Christian. If you have received it, you'll know a wholeness and completeness in your life and a power in your life that help you live as He wants you to live. And you'll also know a fellowship and intimacy with Him because that has been restored. Because He has offered you forgiveness and all you've done is said, I'm sorry. Now I'm going to take some questions. But before actually, maybe we should take some questions first. Let me just phrase it like this. Before this meeting officially ends, and I've actually spoken for slightly longer than normal, you have to forgive me. I was in Hong Kong on Sunday, Oxford on Monday, Chicago on Tuesday, Memphis on Tuesday evening, Dallas on Wednesday. I got back into London today. So I'm speaking slightly slower than I normally speak. And so my talk has taken me 10 minutes longer than it normally would because, anyway, no, but just to let you know, before this finishes, I'm going to take any question now. You can either text it or you can just stand up and speak. I'm happy with either. I will be offering the chance for you to pray a prayer like I prayed. If you're in that place where you know you need to say yes to God, where you need that reconciliation with God that comes through Jesus Christ. Right? Okay, so that's just to let you know. Now, if you're not sure, please don't do that. If you need to find out, then there are groups here where you can go and discuss and ask your questions and find out more and do all kinds of stuff. There's the Gospel of Mark here you can take away and you can read. But before we finish, I'm going to offer that. Right, so it's just so that you can be thinking about it. So if you've been wrestling with this for a while, okay, and you've been wondering, and you know that this evening you've been gripped by God Himself, and you need to say sorry to Him and you want to receive and welcome Him and know this new life, then I'm going to offer a prayer for you. But before we get to that point, do you have any questions? I'm willing to take any question about anything, unless it's of a sexual nature, in which case my good friend Wolfgang will answer it for you. But would anyone like to ask me a question or text a question?
Should we start a couple of being texted in?
Oh, really? Have we got some already? Go ahead.
Yeah. So you can carry on texting questions in, otherwise we can take some from the floor. So at one point you referred to de-godding of God. One person has asked, how does saying God died a human death not de-God God?
Ha! That's a really good question. Okay. All right. Let's just talk about that phrase a little bit. If there is a personal God in this universe who's actually interested in you and who created you, wants a relationship with you, turning your back on him, when we talk about de-godding God, it's not the analogy is not perfect by any means. It will basically be like trying to undo the commitments and so on that you've made to your wife. Does that make sense? So I'm married. Okay, we are now one, and we're meant to be one. Any betrayal by me, my turning my back on her, my going away, my ignoring her, my whatever, just saying, hey, it's my life, I can do what I want with it now, okay, is a betrayal of her. Does that make sense? It's not a good phrase, it doesn't exist in English, but we now live in a culture where we can make up words, which is great. I'm unwifing her, right? Now, I know that technically, I would actually argue that you can't really do that, but that's what I'm doing in reality. So now, here comes the next question. And it's a very profound question, if I understand your question correctly, which is this. Okay, if God is God, and if Jesus Christ is God, and he comes to this earth and he dies on a cross, and he's now dead, and then 3 days later he's raised to life, how doesn't that de-God him, ungod him, make him less than God? Now that is a brilliant question. Wolfie, what's the answer? No. Let me try. Let me try to answer that for you. In the Christian faith, we say that God is love. Not that God is loving, although we say that too, which describes an action, something he does, but that he is love in his very nature. Now, let's just go back to what we said. Love is a quality that exists between personal beings. You need at least 2 of them. So I can only talk about someone who is love as opposed to being loving if they're all by themselves. They need someone else to be loving too. I can remember when my first daughter was born, she was given a book. It was called Someone to Love. And the story was this. There was a God. He created a beautiful blue and green planet on it because he was all alone. And after he created this blue and green planet, he put people on it. And now at last he had someone to love. Right? Okay. Well, this book was not tossed aside lightly. It was thrown with great force and it went straight into the bin. Because this is not what the Christian teaching about God is. The Christian teaching about God is that there is one Godhead. And within that Godhead, there are 3 persons. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. One Godhead, 3 persons. Now, some people try to make out this as contradictory, but it's not. This is like me saying, look, there is one marriage. There is me and there is my wife. We are 2 separate persons. When I got married, I did not become her and she did not become me. Okay, but we did become one. One marriage, 2 persons. The Bible uses the same language to talk about the church, by the way. Okay, there's one church, many parts of the body. Okay, one thing, one. And that's exactly how the Bible talks about God. The word, when Jesus says God is one, he uses what's called a neuter plural, which is slightly unusual. It's like talking about one thing. Okay, but then he talks about 3 persons within it. So what happens at the cross? The second person of the Trinity is incarnate. The Bible does say he, emptying of himself, he came down into this world and was found in human likeness. And having lived amongst us, and having been born with us, he went to the cross. Now here's what happened at the cross. At the cross, the Bible says he became sin for us. He became a curse for us, literally. He took on into himself everything that is wrong within us and all the consequences it deserves. All of the punishment that it should rightly have. All of that he takes on into himself. Now, let me ask you a question. If God were God, if Jesus Christ were God, how would you kill him? Kryptonite? So this is why this is such a profound question. It's a very, very profound question. Let me put another spin on this for you. Let's suppose I were to say to you, look, can I kill you? But I can guarantee in 3 days' time, you'll come back to life. And let's supposing that were true. Let's supposing I could kill you in one of any 100 ways. It doesn't have to be crucifixion. I can chop your head off, bullet through the brain. Okay. And it is a guaranteed fact, and you know it's a guaranteed fact, that 3 days later you'll come back to life. Here's the question. Would it be a big deal to die? Some of you aren't sure about this, in case I'm going to move from theory into practice at this point. So I can see your... But, and the answer is, that's not a big deal, right? If you knew, if it was a guaranteed fact, and actually it would definitely happen, okay? You're dead, 3 days later you come back to life. I mean, what a cool story for the kids later. That is not a big deal. So what's the big deal about Jesus Christ dying on the cross then? This is why Jesus Christ said before he died, no one takes my life from me. Freely I lay it down, and freely I'll pick it up again. So there's that side to it. Okay? No one takes my life from me. Freely I lay it down. Freely I'll pick it up again. But at the same time, as Jesus Christ is hanging on the cross, he cries out, my God, referring to the Father, why have you forsaken me? God is love. He exists in a set of living, loving relationships. God does not create us out of need, because he needs us to experience love. He is love, and out of love, he creates us. Love is destroyed through sin. I can promise you, if you deeply love someone, you love them to the point where it hurts in a good way when you think of them, and they betray you, you're going to experience a pain unlike anything you've ever known before. And if you've experienced that kind of pain, you've probably cried the kinds of tears where you run out of tears and you're still trying to cry and it actually hurts. When Jesus Christ is willing to take on the consequence of what we have done, when he becomes sin, when he becomes a curse for us, that's exactly what happens. That's the big deal. It terrified Jesus, by the way. In the Garden of Gethsemane, just before he was betrayed and crucified, sweating blood and tears, he said, if it's possible, take this cup from me, but not my will, your will be done, speaking with his Father. So having said, I'm going to freely lay it down and freely take it up, at the same time, that brokenness that would come, that fracture that would come, however you want to talk about it, was enormous. He was paying the price for what we have morally done wrong. And it was huge. His physical body was given over. His spirit is not destroyed, but it is imprisoned. And he conquers over even sin and death, having paid the price for it. There's just so much more. That one question could legitimately be given an entire book in response. As a matter of fact, there is a book written in response to it. It's called The Cross of Christ by John Stott, which is an excellent book. I don't know if have any of you read. If you have never read the book, The Cross of Christ by John Stott, just put up your hand, just out of interest. I'll just be intrigued. If you've never read that book, don't be ashamed. Oh, shame on you. That's a great book. And if that's the kind of question that really gets you, I'd wholeheartedly recommend reading that book. And if you don't have the money to buy it, I'll send you one. There's another question.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So therefore, if God was not lacking in anything when he created man,
why did he create us?
so therefore, if there has to be a lover,
Yeah.
there has to be a beloved.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have a machine.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. So hence why the Godhead, why the Trinity is so important.
So therefore, if God was not lacking in anything when he created man, when God created man, did he not create man to love him and worship him?
Right. Oh, no, he did. Yes, but there's a question about saying that he did do that and then he did it out of need. Need would imply he's cosmically lonely. And in order to experience love, if God is one, just one person, he cannot experience or express love. He cannot experience or express love until he creates another personal being.
That's right.
If God is Trinitarian, it means that even before God created the world, before he created us, he still exists in a set of living, loving relationships. It's really interesting. Someone once asked a theologian, what was God doing before he created the universe? To which he replied, making hell for people who ask difficult questions. Because it seems to imply that God had nothing to do. And then we come along and suddenly he's busy. But if you exist in a set of living, loving relationships, have you ever been that intimately connected to someone even at a human level, you suddenly become aware of the fact how quickly time moves. So God was not lonely or bored before he does create, but he does create knowing what it would cost to redeem us. Okay. No, we don't. He does. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, let's take another question.
Another question. So I think this is more for clarification. So how exactly does Jesus' death resolve all the problems in the life of the woman in the book or in my life?
Ah, okay. That's also a very good question. The character in the book is crying out for two things: redemption, transformation. By redemption, I'm assuming what she means is she's assuming the normal meaning, and then it talks about again here. Is there a path, a story of redemption, of fresh beginnings, of second chances? But in the way I've chosen, there's only sorrow. So it's a very interesting book. Redemption is to do with forgiveness. When you talk about redemption relationally, you're talking about restoring relationship. Jesus Christ's death on the cross, the fact that he is willing to pay the price and forgive us, is an offer of redemption, restoration of relationship. Look, it would be like, in most cultures of the world, forgiveness is earned as opposed to received. By that I mean, you can take my good friend Wolfgang. Let's suppose I insult him again. Okay, I make fun of him, and I say, well, let's make it about you this time. Okay, you ask me a question, and I look at you and I say, you are clearly a moron. The Greek word, from which we get the English word moron, means to be a moron. And you are a prime example of it. Let's suppose I respond to you like that. Now, how would you feel about that? Again, this is where we should have shipped in a few Pentecostals from a neighboring church to provide a little bit of interaction with the audience. The answer is, well, a little bit upset. Let's take the English response. I'm a little bit upset, as opposed to my Mediterranean blood, which would say, I'm going to come and smash your face in. Right? You're a little bit upset. And then I look at you. Again, everybody leaves. You're the last person to leave. And as I walk out, I pat you on the shoulder and say, sorry for insulting you like that. And I just walk out. Would you forgive me? Be honest. No. Now, let's suppose I insult you. Publicly, eloquently, humorously. And having finished my insult, after 2 seconds, my bottom lip begins to quiver. My eyes fill up with tears. I fall down on my knees and I start weeping and wailing. I crawl up to where you're sitting. I clasp your feet. And in between the sobs and the weeps and the wails, I start begging you for forgiveness. Now, would you forgive me? Okay, I can see you're hard to please, but you will probably forgive me when you think I've suffered enough. Right? Okay? When I've paid a big enough price, when there's been a clear enough conviction of existential guilt and remorse, when it's really cut me to the bone. Maybe even better when something bad's happened to me or my family too. I've lost my job or some terrible illness has also befallen me too. And, I'm really laid low. You may look at me and say, I forgive you. In almost every culture of the world, forgiveness is earned. Except in the Christian faith. In Christian faith, forgiveness is not earned from God. God is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. It is offered as a gift. Before we think that we have even done something wrong, God comes and offers us forgiveness as a gift. It's called grace. This is what the earlier example I used about Wolfie. If after having insulted him, thinking there's nothing wrong with anything I've done, and he comes and starts extending grace to me, his offer of forgiveness to me can be convicting in its nature. Okay, that's redemption, reconciliation. The other one we talked about was new life, new beginnings. This is what Jennifer is asking about. Is there a new life? Is there a second chance? Is transformation possible? I'm changing. I've changed, I'm different. And the answer is yes, there is. With God in Christ, you can be changed. You won't be made perfect, but you will be different. You'll certainly be facing a different way.
We've got about 2 more questions on the text, unless any more come in. You used the phrase relationship with God What do you mean by that?
Right. Okay. It's interesting when we talk about having a relationship with someone. We often think what we mean by that is that you're talking to them. And certainly that's a part of a relationship, talking to people. Have you ever noticed that there are some people with whom you have such an intimate relationship? Being in their presence is actually the main thing that you want. I don't know if you've ever known that. Just being with them, that's the main thing you want. See, it's interesting, especially with modern technology, the distinction between these two is made even clearer. I speak to my family every day on the telephone, okay, with the wonders of modern thing, and with FaceTime. I can even see them while I'm speaking to them. And with the iPad 3, I'm sure with the new power, I'll even be able to maybe project an improved image of me to them. Maybe digitally enhanced, touched up, and if press reports are to be believed by, running at about 116 degrees Fahrenheit. And I love doing that. But that's not the same as being with them. I think if you were to give them the option between a 5-hour conversation with me with Facebook and a 5-minute hug, I know which one they'll go for. When we talk about having a relationship with God, we're talking about being in his presence, enjoying fellowship with him. Not just about talking, which we have a technical word for in the Christian faith, it's called praying. It's not just about that. It's about intimacy, it's about fellowship. It's about making that connection. It means about God not being distant or far away. It's about knowing his very presence with you. Yeah.
One more question, then open up to the floor. What about those who live good lives for the most part, but aren't Christians? Is it not unfair to judge them and forgive those who are immoral, but happen to be Christians?
That's a really good question. Well, let me just read to you again what Paul, first of all, said, because we read it earlier. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the earth, and he determined the time set for them and the places where they should live. And God did this so that men would seek him, and perhaps reach out for him, and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. It's very interesting. When I get asked that question in England, and I'm not sure if that's where this question is coming from, people say to me, look, it's not fair. In England, you're more likely to become a Christian than if you're living in some, let's say, atheistical, totalitarian regime or whatever. Well, if that were true, how would you, for example, explain the presence of the church in China? In 1960, the communist government, in order to preserve its atheistical ideology, expelled every missionary from China. I remember meeting with a guy, telling the story of one woman whose father was a very big landowner at the time. He was Chinese, but he was a believer. The government, in the name of communism and atheism, confiscated everything he had. Put him on trial. When he refused to renounce his faith, killed him. They then brought her as his daughter into a stadium with 50,000 people sat there in front of, and all the judges sitting in the middle of the stadium on the playing field, where she was told she had to renounce her Christian faith if she wanted to have any legal existence in China, and she refused. And for 35 years, she basically was cleaning the sewage. They had open sewers, and her job with a broom was to sweep the sewage along. Does that make sense? To keep the flow going, the open sewer. Okay. 12 hours a day. Okay. Living in the basement, one room of the basement of the entire block of property that her father used to own in Beijing. So the question is, how is it in a country where the church was systematically expelled, every Christian book burned, Bibles destroyed, that the largest church in the world by far is in China, estimated between 60 to 120 million people. No one's quite sure. What the Bible promises is if you're truly seeking after God, he will make himself available to you. I love telling this story. It's one of my favorite stories. We'll just finish with this, and then it's 7:45, and I know some of you may have to leave. It's the end of term. But I'm happy to hang around and talk to you if that's what you would like. But I'm going to share this, and then if you're at that point where you know you'd like to pray, then I'm going to just offer a prayer and we'll call it quits. I think there's drink outside, right? Yeah. Okay, and food and stuff. Okay, you'll be given instructions about what happened, and I'm going to hang around to talk to you if you want to. A good friend, Iranian friend of mine, who I got to know, 16 years ago now. First time I ever visited him, he showed me a picture of a group of men, 35 men, on his desk. And I just picked up the picture. I said, "Who are all these people?" He said, "Oh, these are pastors of mine." And then he said, after the revolution he says, half of these people were killed. And then his wife was sitting next to me, and she said, "Ooh, tell them the story about this guy." And pointed to one of them. So he told me the story about the guy who she pointed to. They'd been driving through a remote part of the Middle East. They stopped off to buy water from a petrol station, and also to fill up the car with petrol. And after he filled up the car, he got back into the car to get his wallet, and he was about to go and pay. And leaning against a small hut by the petrol station was a man with a machine gun over his shoulder. And the wife looked at him and said, and then looked at her husband as he leant in the car and said, "That man with the gun, you should give him a Bible." And the guy looked at the gun, and he looked at the guy's expression, and he said, "No, I don't think that's a good idea." And she said, No, I think you should give him a Bible. And picked up a Bible and put it in her husband's pocket. The husband walked in, paid, and as he walked into the petrol station, this man with the gun followed him inside. A few minutes later, the man comes out carrying bags filled with water. The man with the gun comes back outside, leans against the wall, folds his arm. Husband and wife drive away. The wife looks at the husband and said, "You didn't give that man a Bible, did you?" He said, "No, I prayed about it. It wasn't the right thing to do." She said, "I really think you should have given it to him." He said, "I don't think it was the right thing to do." So then she bowed her head in the car, and she prayed out loud, and she prayed along the lines of, "Oh God, on the day of judgment, may that man's blood be on my husband's head and not on mine. He's the one who refused to give him a Bible." At this point, the car stopped, and they had one of those friendly conversations that married couples have from time to time, which ended with the words, "If you want me to die, I will." They drive back into the town. The man gets out of the car, walks up to the man, presents him with the Bible, doesn't say anything, and starts walking back to the car, slightly nervously. He hears a huge thud, and he turns around, and the man he's given the Bible to has just collapsed on the floor. So he goes back to him, and he helps him back up to his feet, and he says, "Are you okay?" And the man says, I don't live here. He said, I live 3 days away from here. But 3 days ago, I had a dream in which an angel came to me and told me to stay in this place until someone came and gave me the book of life. So thank you for giving me this book. If it's the case that God loves each one of us, then it's also the case that if he is God, he can so orchestrate all affairs that on the day of judgment, no one will have excuse before him. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what's promised in the scriptures. That on the day of judgment, when we stand before God, no one will have a valid excuse before him to say, "Hey, what about me? It wasn't fair for me." So I guess that brings me back to where you are. Now, I realize that you may be in one of 3 different places right now. You may have come along this evening totally unsure, or maybe you're dragged along under false pretenses, being told it was going to be interesting when it manifestly hasn't. Well, if that's you, but all you want to do is find out more, then do take this Gospel of Mark with you, and there are these little forms. And if you want to talk to someone, or you'd like to read something, or you'd like to find out about other events, if you fill that out, people will be in touch with you. It's entirely possible that you're here and you are a Christian already. In which case, I would just like to refer you back to those words from Martin Luther King I read. That there was a time when the church was revered and respected for the price and sacrifice it was prepared to pay by following that which it knew to be right. And I'd like to ask you this question. Are you doing that which is right before God? Are you actually living as he would have you live? Or are you so caught up with life, pursuit of money, pornography, whatever it may be. That actually, no, you're not. Well, there's forgiveness. I'd ask you to, this evening, give yourself wholly over to him. Third possibility is that you are on the outside looking in, as it were. You're not a Christian, but as you sit here, you do know that before God, you do need to repent and you need to put your faith and trust in him. That you do need both the forgiveness, the redemption, and the new life, the transformation that he offers. And if that's you, I'd like to be able to pray for you. And so, don't do this if you don't mean it. But if you are in that place where you know that's what you have to do, either because you're so far away, no one can possibly tell you're a Christian right now, or because you've been thinking about this for a while, and this is just the time where you need to know, make it clear with him about where you stand, then I'd like to pray for you. So I'd invite you just to bow your heads for a second, if that's what you'd all like to do. Don't worry, if you have a wallet and you're worried about some point about someone stealing you, just put your hand on your wallet or your phone or whatever it is you're scared of possibly losing, and I would like to be able to pray for you, if that's where you are. So, let's let this gentleman move out. So, if you know you need to pray, just pray this prayer along with me. It's a simple prayer. It simply recognizes God as God, thanks him for Christ, for the cross, for the price he paid, for his triumphing over sin and death. It's a prayer of repentance. It says, I'm sorry for what I've done wrong. And of faith, I put my trust in you. I want to receive both you and the forgiveness and know this new life. And it's a promise also to follow God, whatever it may cost you. Okay, so if this is where you are, then will you just pray with me? Father, I thank you that there's no one like you. And I thank you that even though you know me and everything about me, including all of my failures, that you sent your Son, Jesus Christ, to come into this world. Jesus, I thank you that when you went to the cross, you paid a price for me. You made both forgiveness and transformation possible. Sorry for what I've done. And I turn away from all that is wrong, and I turn to you. I put my trust in you. I pray that I may know you and the new life you bring. And I pray that with you, that you will help me follow you all the days of my life, whatever it may cost me, and wherever you may lead me. Amen. If you did pray that prayer for whatever reason, sincerely, I'd love to be able to talk with you. I'm going to hang around. If you have questions, I'd love to be able to talk to you. If you disagreed with everything I said and you want to come and tell me why, I'd love to talk to you. And if you have large sums of money you'd like to give me, then speak to the CU leaders over here. Thank you very much for having me. You've listened very well. I realise it's been quite a long evening. I hope it made sense, and thank you very much for giving me your attention.
Thank you very much. And yes, please do feel free to hang around. We've got plenty of food and drink outside. Michael will be here to ask questions. Don't forget the feedback forms. If you have prayed, you may want to put that on there. If you don't know anyone in the CU to come and speak to, or you can come and speak to me or Michael or whoever you came with. So food outside. Thank you very much for coming.